Good afternoon, everybody. So we have a collective mission in the next hour, which is to stay alert and engaged without succumbing to the narcotic effects of the curry. So look forward to jumping in. Just to start, wind this back a few decades, this is actually my father, who was a test pilot for the Royal Navy and was one of the chief test pilots on the Harrier and its carrier trials. And how I ended up spending the rest of my life in America is based very much on this story, because in the early 70s, many of you will know that the US Marine Corps took on the Harrier as part of its tactical objectives, and then they had a nasty habit of killing themselves. And so part of the NATO exchange was to send over some of the British pilots that had actually had deep experience to begin teaching and training the US pilots how to do that. And from there, my father stayed on as an exchange instructor at the US Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River in Maryland, near Annapolis and Washington, which is where I ended up growing up. And in his study, all of the squadron plaques were always around, and I remember the one from the Empire Test Center, and it had that motto, learn to test and test to learn. And that always stuck with me, and in many ways been carrying forward that legacy of how do we push the limits, how do we take things to and past their fail points and document it so that we can then come back and share that knowledge and information with others. So with that, it's an honor to be back home and an honor to continue that tradition. So let's start with a story. There were several I wanted to tell, and I ended up settling on this one. But this was 2013, and it was the America's Cup, the most famous and the oldest international sporting event in history. If you exclude the long fallow period of the Olympics from ancient Greece to when they booted back up again. And in 2013, this Oracle boat, which was founded and funded by Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, spent a pile of money, 10 million pounds, to build this contraption. And if you notice it, you guys might be Army, but even so, right? You can see this thing is not like a normal boat. It is actually hovering off the water. And what you see here are actually masts that go and connect to what looks like carbon fiber dolphin wings or hydrofoils underneath the water. And Ellison's not so subtle strategy was just to try and outspend the competition. And everybody else was going to try and catch up. Now, something strange, though, happened in the finals. So this was the Oracle boat against the Kiwis. And despite having outspent them, despite having a team of 30 software engineers calculating the optimal strategies, these guys were getting their asses handed to them. They were down 6-1 against the Kiwis. And the interesting thing, this goes back to Commonwealth legacies and grudge matches, is that the Oracle skipper's name was Jimmy Spithill, and he was an Aussie. So he was level-headed damned if he was going to be losing to the Kiwis. And so what he did in the last minute was he fired the tactician, he canned the entire software staff, and he said, right, what are they doing? We're not. How are they beating us? And the way that the Kiwis had figured it out was that these hydrofoils, basically, once you get up on a plane, they defy all the prior hydrodynamics of sailing. So the old rule used to be is that a boat could only go as fast as a coefficient times its wet hull length. So basically, the longer and thinner the boat, that's why rowing sculls look the way they do, right? The longer and thinner the boat is, the faster it can go up to a point and no further, because then the more energy it has going through the water, the more drag or bow wave it creates. Well, hydrofoils completely demolish that. These boats can sail up to 55, 60 miles an hour. They're so lethal, they're the sort of Formula One machines of the water. They're so lethal that someone got killed in practice for this race. But what the Kiwis had figured out was, hey, we can go on, we can sail downwind, we can sail offwind and get up on these hydrofoils. But going upwind used to be the hard, slow thing of zigzagging into the wind. They realized, hey, instead of forcing it to try and get to our upwind destination the way we always have, what if we unlock the exponential power of being up on these hydrofoils? What if we, instead of trying to get straight to our destination, as aggressively and slowly as possible, what if we actually bear off the wind? What if we cover much more distance, but do it at warp speed? So that was something that the Oracle engineers had missed. They had made the assumption that even with the new technology, they still were following a relatively old strategy. Because the Kiwis were the upstarts, because they were hungry, they innovated and they said, we will go further faster and ultimately get off our goal to get to our destination sooner. Well, as soon as Spithill figured that out, just by watching and observing his competition, he changed tactics. And the Oracle boat came back to win 8 races to 7 in the greatest comeback in this sport's history. So what does this mean for us? Why are we telling this story today? Well, the possibilities, as we've talked about with leadership in the digital age, with the prospects of quantum computing, AI, drone warfare, you name it. The question is, are we able to adapt our strategies to capitalize on the new technologies? Are we able to modify what we do to get up on a plane, to defy the existing laws of physics and the way we think the race is run? So what we're going to talk about, this is in 3 parts. The first thing we're going to talk about is what is the equivalent for us? What is the equivalent in human performance and leadership that matches that story of the Oracle boat and the America's Cup win? And we're going to talk about what is north of happy. This is a shot of Mount Everest. I was actually, had the good fortune and the good luck to be on the north face of Everest many years ago. We were the only climbing team on the mountain. And in fact, a bunch of Brits had come and been basically weathered out for 1 month. We had met them in Lhasa, gone off and done a lot of other climbing and adventuring, come back to base camp on the north side, on the Tibetan side, and they packed up in disgust. And then the next day, we had this incredible weather window of 3 beautiful bluebird days. But what we're talking about here is not optimal psychology. This is not 10% happier. What we're talking about are exponential levels of accelerated performance and what they look like. Because in the last 10 years in particular, there has been a quiet revolution in what is considered ultimate human performance. And it's been happening predominantly in 2 areas. It's been happening in special operations communities, and it's been happening in extreme athletic realms, specifically kind of Olympic pursuits and extreme sports, the kind of things where there's life and limb on the line if you bugger it up. And something that is interesting about this sort of, silent revolution is, if that's true, if this has been happening, why on earth haven't we heard about it? And there's actually something fairly straightforward that's been happening. We can see here, we have the 2 communities of practice, right? The athletes and the operators. And neither of them are especially incented to share what they're finding, right? The first group, the athletes, want to say a step up on the podium. If they've cracked the code, if they have a secret sauce, they're going to keep it to themselves. And the other, the special operators, want to say a step ahead of the bad guys. They don't want to disclose OPSEC, and if they have an innovation, they'd like to keep it tightly held. Now that all makes fair sense, but the R&D side is equally problematic. On the academics, the sort of the brilliant researchers, right, there's a lot of things going on. I mean, one is just parochialism. The idea of I'd like to have my name on the peer-reviewed published paper, keeping cards and data close to the vest. And the other is also just the simple sense of living in silos. We did a project with Red Bull and their athletic team with some researchers from Cornell University in the US, and they were studying nitric oxide. And they were studying nitric oxide on the role of nitric oxide in endurance athletes. And I thought, oh, fantastic. This is exactly who I want to be talking to. And I was like a giddy kid. I would say, you guys are the experts. You're the specialists. We are really interested in the role of nitric oxide as a neurotransmitter for enhancing peak performance. What can you tell us? And he kind of looked at me blankly and said, I don't know, mate. All we're studying is VO2 max and perceived effort during extended endurance. And I thought, good God, like Harvard, literally a couple of hours up the road from Cornell, there's a major researcher who has cracked nitric oxide and its role in performance. The guys right next door weren't even thinking about it or talking about it. And in the smart tech and innovation space, we have a different problem, but it all kind of intersects to keep this field weirdly locked down and opaque. to the rest of us. Because when you see smart tech, is anybody familiar with Fitbit watches or the old, the Nike sports bands or any of the kind of wearables? I'm wearing an Oura ring right now. It allows you to track your sleep and energy levels. Well, typically what happens is these companies are started by some brilliant engineer, researcher, or entrepreneur, and then they take on venture capital. And there might be initial research, published papers, early data, seems really encouraging. Hey, maybe some electrical stimulation to the brain does something worthwhile. Hey, maybe a supplement does something interesting. Maybe a measurement algorithm will give us an insight. But over time, the investment structure and the incentives, they're like, hey, you've been at this 3 years. Where's our return on investment? And they start hiring chief marketing officers, and the board starts making mandates. And the next thing you know, they're taking things to market, flogging it as the be-all and end-all, when in reality it's partial and only a piece of the problem. So most of the smart tech up to now has been over-promising and under-delivering. So we end up with a fragmented discipline that is not delivering to the rest of us what we actually need as far as return on investment and return on potential impact. So let's talk about what are some of these peak states that we're going to discuss today, and what is possible when we learn more about them, and we also learn to harness them. So one that we'll be focusing on specifically is called a flow state. And it was literally, not particularly imaginatively, coined that, because at the University of Chicago, Dr. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, which is how you spell that mouthful of a name at the bottom, he realized that people time and again described being in an optimal state where everything felt fluid, everything felt easy, and as they said, it just flowed. Now this was interesting because this was a psychological state that he was describing, right? 100 years earlier, these were considered religious or mystical states. This was typically expressed and described in terms of spiritual or devotional terms. I've experienced the grace of God. I did, anything along those lines. But in the 1950s, psychologist Abraham Maslow interviewed a bunch of atheists, and they too had these experiences. So something went from the mythological and the religious to the psychological. And now, as we've entered this new era of research and data, it is even into the neurobiological. So this is not about belief. This is not even about mind. This is actually mechanistic neurobiology. And the good thing about if we've taken it to that level of precision is that neurobiology is hackable. We can do things with it. So some of the key features of a peak performance state, specifically flow states, is a sort of three-step combo of selflessness, timelessness, and effortlessness. When we enter these states, and combat is one of the surest fire ways to get there, right? You lose all inner chatter. Your inner monologue goes completely quiet. You become immersed in what researchers call the deep now, to the point of even experiencing time dilation. So if any of you have experienced, what was popularized in the film The Matrix as bullet time, if you've ever experienced a slowing down in critical incidents and the ability to basically process information and make decisions with an expanded sense of time, that's part of what is happening here. And a sense of action and awareness coming together. I'm no longer thinking and giving instructions to do the thing. I'm doing the thing before I even realized I needed to do the thing. And obviously, these are powerful states. And not only are they powerful, but they're highly rewarding. So in a nutshell, for our applications in leadership, there's a lot to learn about flow states and their potential impact. But I'll start with just kind of three that are helpful for our specific context. And the first is that because when we enter these states, there is a neurochemical cascade that is signaling to our bodies and brains, this is important, it's salient, stamp and save this for later, and then integrate this into your long-term learning. This is a highly self-rewarding motivator and driver. The technical term is autotelic. It means from the Greek, autotelios. It has its own meaning or reason for being. Said more colloquially, it's addictive. You want to keep doing it because of its own reward. The next, and obviously 10,000 hours to practice is a popular misnomer. Sometimes it's 1,500 hours to mastery, sometimes it's 20,000 hours, sometimes it's never because you're just not that good. But nonetheless, harnessing flow states as part of a training and practice strategy can massively compress the amount of time it takes to get to mastery. And the final, and this is not exactly right, it's not that people who experience flow are the happiest on the earth, it's actually that they experience the highest level of life satisfaction, which, as you guys know from both training and combat situations, you can experience profound and intense satisfaction from some of the hardest conditions and experiences imaginable. So that's the potential sort of performance boost. Now, that might seem hyperbolic, it might seem a little sort of Pollyanna-ish, but in the last 10 years, as we've sort of started breaking down those silos, and as this research and its potential applications have been bleeding out into more mainstream environments, everyone from McKinsey to Forbes to Fortune 500 companies have been tracking it and realizing that the return on investment for putting their leaders and their teams into peak states is massively worth the investment. McKinsey's was 490% return, which means you could literally spend Monday in a peak state, take the rest of the week off, and keep pace with your peers. Now, it's not that easy, and an 8-hour stretch is actually incredibly hard to pull off. But the premise remains that if you're thinking about how to keep your teams in peak performance, one of the levers to pull, one of the ways to help us address all of that complexity and uncertainty that we were talking about this morning is to help them spend as much time as possible in these states. Now, John Hagel runs the Center for the Edge. It's basically the sort of skunk works of Deloitte. And their research has been diving deeply into this. And they've been finding that the teams that go the furthest, the fastest, and are consistently the most innovative and adaptive are the ones harnessing flow states in order to get their job done. So that is a description of what happens when we can create heightened performance by hacking or tuning our state of awareness, our neurophysiology, in a given moment. And the performance gains are startling. They're really substantial. But there is another component to this that I want to talk about specifically to you guys because of the theme of this conference and the roles and responsibilities you all hold, which is how can we harness these states, these altered states, in service of developing altered traits? How can we actually use this awareness, use this versatility to accelerate leadership development? Because the first thing to realize is that in the conditions we're facing, in those that are VUCA conditions, the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world that we are in, and increasingly more so, that technical or horizontal skill acquisition is inadequate. It simply isn't enough to get the job done. Vertical development, the ability to add layers of complexity to our meaning making and our sense making and our strategizing, is a non-negotiable. And that flow states, learning to harness them, can do two things. It can help us in the synchronous moment, the now, boost our performance individually and collectively. But also diachronically, meaning over time, it can actually accelerate the rate and height of our development as leaders. So has anybody heard of the Flynn Effect? It was basically the idea of in standardized testing, SATs, intelligence scores, that kind of thing, that over the 20th and 21st century, scores have just been sort of miraculously creeping upwards. And no one knew why for a long time until Dr. Effect, no, actually Dr. Flynn, right, was down in New Zealand. He was also a Kiwi. He realized, he actually sort of saw this. He saw this in the data sets. And he began tracking it, and he began asking researchers all around the world, different measurement, different batteries, different tests and systems, and it all started showing something consistent, which is that somehow there was this sort of rising tide of intelligence. What was going on? And it was very hard for them to pin down. But then suddenly there was this fascinating test case in the Soviet Union. Because as we all know, the big sort of the Stalinization of the Soviet Union was trying to drag a 19th century agrarian peasant economy kicking and screaming into Marx's industrial world. And that transition was brutal and effective. But as that wave was happening, there was this fascinating and once-in-a-lifetime case study. There were some Russian psychologists who were able to go way out into the boonies of Uzbekistan. And they were able to find and contrast farming communities that had already been socialized with herding communities way up in the mountains who hadn't seen it at all. And they tried to give those folks the same intelligence tests that everybody else around the developed world were experiencing this rise in. And they basically would sit down with the goat herders, the villagers, the men and the women, and they'd ask them a series of questions. They have them sort out skeins of wool, different colors, and they say, can you group these? And they would say, no, there's no ability to group these. Even the weavers couldn't understand that shades of blue went together as shades of blue. They were different. When they asked them to say which one of these is not like the other kinds of tests, they would say, hey, there's a hatchet, a knife, a hammer, and a deer. Which one of these doesn't belong? And they would say, the hammer. And they would think, well, why the hammer? And they would say, well, because you need the hatchet and the knife to kill and dress the deer. When given examples of shapes, a square drawn with solid lines versus a square drawn with dotted lines, they say, and then a lot of other shapes. Well, which are the similar ones? And they say, well, it's not those two, because that square with the solid line, that's a map. And the square with the dotted line, that's a watch. What are you talking about? They were unable to abstract their thinking up to the level of symbolic categorization. It literally wasn't available. It was all context-bound capabilities, application. So what we were seeing in the rest of the world, and this is true in countries that even had drops in maths scores, drops in reading scores, is that the abstract complexity was still going up. Now, the question is we are the 21st century's equivalent of those Uzbeki goat herders. We're staring at information that we can't wrap our heads around. We can't see the patterns because we're not able to see the higher order that makes the organizing principle. Now take a look at this. I mean, obviously, the NSA, as many of the three-letter agencies and MOD as well, are thinking deeply about this stuff. But what are we doing when it is no longer the Battle of Britain, no longer Dunkirk, no longer singular, overtly bad enemies with a monolithic force to resist? What happens when we're dealing with the knock-on effects of a drought in Syria in the summer of 2006 and 2007 that displaced a ton of young farmers, that pushed them to the cities, that then Assad sold off a lot of the country's grain supplies because they were getting top dollar in the marketplace, that then weirdly intersected with the advent of mobile phones and Twitter, that then gave us the Arab Spring, that then created the refugee crisis, that then broke the EU, that then fueled Brexit, that is now potentially dropping in your laps the unification of Ireland and security on the northern border that's been put to bed for 30 years. That is multiple orders of complexity, higher than anything a standing military has ever been expected to make sense of. Anybody seen either of these books? This was The Naked Diplomat. Tom Fletcher was the UK's ambassador to Jordan. The other is The Seventh Sense by Josh Ramos. Anybody read Seventh Sense? Okay, do get it. It's a fascinating book. Josh is the CEO of Henry Kissinger and Associates, so global strategic consultancy firm, and has some interesting things to say. I was fortunate enough to be invited to an event down with the Branson family down on Necker Island, and was sitting next to Tom at lunch. And he's got a blog actually called The Naked Ambassador, I think, so you can, or The Naked Diplomat. So feel free to check it out. But he was describing, it was 2011 to 2015, where he was the ambassador to Jordan, and he was describing and saying, look, I said, that must have been an almighty shit show. Like, what was that like? And he said, well, it was surprisingly uplifting to see the resilience and to see the amount of dedication. He said, everybody told me I would lose my faith in humanity by getting that assignment, but in fact, I left reaffirmed. But he said, this was the hard truth of the matter. And I told him this. I said, look, the refugees you're dealing with, as crazy as this is, as destabilizing as it potentially is, they're your cousins. They're your kin. They speak the same languages. Many of them have the same last names. You worship the same gods. You love and enjoy the same foods and the same music. In the next decade, you're going to have 3 to 5 million sub-Saharan Africans rolling through your neck of the woods. What are you going to do then? You have to be able to expand your capabilities and your capacity ahead of the challenges we know are coming. Otherwise, this all gets much worse for everybody. And Ramos' point is sort of the opposite. It's not the idea that to beat quantum computing, we all have to become cyborgs. It's that to understand this digital age and its complexity and ambiguity and volatility, that we actually have to become more deeply human. And if you haven't come across this fellow, he's a friend and a colleague of ours. His name is Jordan Greenhall. Just Google him on Medium. He has written some of the most in fact, such insightful. He's an independent scholar, but he's just laid out some things about the current information warfare and the current information ecology, specifically around populism, Brexit, the ascendancy of the Trump presidency, the rise of crazy things like QAnon, which I don't know if you guys track over here, but it's basically like the master mashup, whack, nut conspiracy theory to end all conspiracy theories that is so popular it's actually showing up in executive branch discourse and retweets. But the idea of what is happening is a breakdown in the bastions of good opinion and the ability for particularly distributed social media, 4chan, 8chan, Reddit, places that are not the New York Times, not the Sunday Telegraph, not the op-ed pages, right, but places where information is mutating and accelerating. These are the things for us to be paying attention to. Because this is what we're looking at, right? We're looking at massive asymmetries in warfare, hardware, and software, right? When, and this is Josh Ramos' point in that book, The Seventh Sense, when you go from hierarchical tops-down information to distributed networks, it's the act of connecting things that changes the things itself. So that when an IED goes off and takes out a diplomat in Kabul on Saturday, and the very same innovative technology ends up in Mosul on Tuesday, that has blown apart any methods of containment, any methods of identifying and attacking key nodes out the window. We're now transnational, we're now real time, and we're now battling hyper objects. Things that don't even exist in real time, whether that's climate change, where is it, or jihad, what is it? Take also Chinese, I mean, not to add to the list of grim things they might be up to, right? Developing super soldiers, 6'6" to 7 feet, excess bone density, VO2 max through the roof, right? And the ability to literally breed the soldiers of tomorrow. While we're all gamely trying to use the CrossFit gym. And then finally, the ability to actually harness the tools we've developed, right? Google, YouTube, I mean, think about it. A $15 kitchen knife and a cell phone camera and one grisly execution posted on YouTube, and ISIS stops the world in its tracks. Every time we deploy, it's millions of pounds. Massive, slow, lumbering efforts to try and address these things. All I have to do is keep playing that game enough times, and the house odds come back to them. Dirt cheap, impossible to stamp out the way we have been. So let's talk about this and get really specific. What does it mean to add vertical complexity? So a simple way to think about this is that most training is the acquisition of tactics. That's like adding apps to your phone or to your iPad, right? And it's very helpful. You know, you learn to jump out of an airplane. You learn to shoot straight. You learn to drive a tank. You learn to distribute intel. You learn all the things, right? The patches on the arms, right? That is horizontal skill acquisition. Vertical development is actually upgrading your operating system. It is actually upgrading the way you make sense of all the skills you acquire. That is typically a massively overlooked and underdeveloped program element. And if we miss it, we're actually running Windows XP while the rest of the world, right, is on the latest and greatest Mac OS. Now, the interesting thing about operating systems is it still does all the old stuff. It just does new things better. The same way you used to have to put in the America Online disk and bing, 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 you've got mail, right? We still get mail, right? We can also watch streaming high-def video in 4D. So that's the capacity that we need to add on. This is what it looks like. This is what the researchers, particularly Bob Keegan at Harvard that I just mentioned, this is what the approximate layout of leadership in the world looks like and where we need to get to. We need, at a minimum, level 6 leaders and level 7 leaders. Level 8, that's the sort of Yodas. You know, generally they're not parts of large organizations, so let's kind of rule that out. These guys are outliers. But level 6, level 7 is where we need as much leadership as possible as soon as possible. And so that is the space where you actually have the capability to make sense of the seemingly senseless. And it's a tiny, tiny fraction of the leadership we're addressing these days. So we often talk about character, we talk about team, we talk about culture, we talk about fit, we talk about a lot of those things, and they are essential. Right? Those are some of the emotional intelligence skills that Jochen was talking about this morning. Right? Essential. But equally essential, potentially even more so, is the operating system or developmental capacity that's holding those things. And it's testable, it's screenable, and it's developable. And the reason this actually lives in this talk, the reason I'm bringing it up, is that what Keegan found in their longitudinal studies at Harvard was it typically takes 3 to 5 whole years for someone to move up a stage organically, just by living life. But that if you harness peak states and accelerated learning, you can compress that, and our studies have found, into as little as 12 months. So if you can take something that used to take 5 years, if it happened at all, and deliver those results in as little as 12 months, that can become a competitive advantage. That is actually expanding the capacity of your leadership and human capital. So now, we've introduced the two things: synchronous performance improvement and diachronic leadership development over time. Those are the two things that understanding harnessing our states can do for us and our teams. So now let's get super practical, because none of that matters if I just get to yammer up here on stage for a bit and you guys go, well, that was mildly interesting, but what the hell? Right, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about actually what to do with it. So there's a lot of conversations, there's a lot of definitions about what does the pinnacle of human experience look like. You can call that ultimate human performance. In religious traditions, it might even be called enlightenment. What is the sort of tippity top of that pyramid we were discussing? And personally, I favor a much more simple, kind of pragmatic definition, which is just that ultimate human performance is nothing more nor less than the ability to seamlessly match state, my internal neurophysiology, to the task at hand. Right? If I'm in combat, I want to be clear-headed and ruthless. If I am soothing my 2-year-old colicky child in the middle of the night, I want to be a tender mammal primate parent. If I'm trying to commune with my maker on a mountaintop, I want to be, aspirational and humble and empty. If I want to be creative, right, I want to be focused and accessing all my skills. So there isn't a single state or place to be that is ideal or best. That's a misnomer, right? The notion of balance, like on a surfboard, the balance is a concept, but where is balance as the wave is jacking up around me, as I'm turning, as I'm doing different things, is forever shifting and changing. And one of the helpful tools, you can think about anybody that has motorbikes or even like a downhill mountain bike, is to think of it like a fork, like a shock-absorbing fork, right? In order for a fork to work, the first thing it has to do is have travel, right? It has to be able to go up and down like a piston. That's so that it can take the hits of life. But if it just had travel without rebound, you'd only have one hit, and then you'd be stuffed. It would no longer be functioning. So you have to have rebound. You have to have the ability to both absorb the hit and return to center. But it needs another thing, which is dampening. Because if it just took the hit and then gave it right back to you with just the amount of force that it went in, you'd be bucked off the bike like a pogo stick. So you need to be able to dissipate energy. So you need to be able to take hits, you need to be able to return to center, and you need to be able to dissipate energy. And if you can do those three things, then the rubber can still meet the road. You can still steer. You have control. So hopefully that's a very kind of just grounded way to think about what are we shooting for. We're talking about range, rebound, and dampening. And for those of you that are on and off duty, I mean, what is, the Army maxim? Hurry up and wait. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the ability to turn on, turn off, recover, come back to center, reload, and be ready again? That's hard. And most folks adapt less than functional means to do so, whether that's vegging on video games, whether that's caffeine and stimulants, whether that's alcohol to take off the edges, right? Whether that's destructive behaviors at home. Right? If we don't have the roadmap, we seek these things out anyway, just less productively than we might if we knew the recipes. So if we pull it all together, this is what it looks like. Right? This is kind of an overarching map of the knobs and the levers we have to play with. Here is kind of the human system. There's obviously lots more. But here are some of the factors, right? We have what's happening in our brain with neurotransmitters, what's happening with stimulus and response, what's happening in our brain waves, what's happening in our heart, right? A catabolic state in our heart is erratic, it's disorganized, it's fundamentally eating us up. Anabolic is like anabolic steroids, like growth producing. So an anabolic state is clear, steady, and coherent. And by the way, back to emotional intelligence, if you want to increase emotional intelligence, create coherent heart rates. USADE Business School did a study with a lot of its graduate students and found that those leaders who had the highest impact and led their teams to the best, most nuanced and sophisticated decisions, complex ones, were those who could actually entrain the people around them to their grounded neurophysiological state, meaning they became the metronome, right? If you think of that old story of Galileo going into the clockmaker's shop and he looked on the wall and he saw that all the pendulums had synced up with the one that was the longest, right? Basically taking leaders and turning them into the longest pendulum in the room, actually grounds and aligns everyone else. These are the stories of the generals calmly, marching down the line on their horse as bullets fly. This is Nelson, and all the stories of Trafalgar, right? I mean, we've enshrined these in our mythology, that when you can keep your head and all about you are losing theirs. It's that. So these are the cheat codes. These are the places that we can access and shift without having to talk about our feelings. Right? Because, I mean, did anybody think, oh, good God, emotional intelligence? I mean, we're not going to have to do that, are we? Right? I mean, I think it was Oscar Wilde said it's every Englishman's goal, solitary aim in life is to make it to his grave unembarrassed. So this is what allows us to get the results, allows us to speak to what we were learning about the significance and the impact of emotional intelligence without necessarily having to talk about our feelings. We can do an end run, and we can come in at the foundational level of neurobiology. So this is what it kind of looks like in a different format, right? Down this side, we have the knobs. There's neuroelectric, neuroanatomical, what part of the brain's turning on and off. This is what brainwave states we're in. This is obviously heart and its capacity to cue everything else. Our endocrine system, even our posture, breathing, rates, depths, rhythms. I mean, how much oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen do we have at any time in our system? And how does it affect both consciousness and performance? All the way down to psychology. You guys have probably heard of grit. You've probably heard of fixed mindsets versus growth mindsets. What operating system? What interpretations are we making as we go? And all the way down to even time. How are we thinking about time, effect, and causation? I, me, now, to everyone, everywhere, every when. That complexity comes online. And if we take a look, here's the cheat. Basically, the right-hand side is where all sorts of fun, interesting, high-performing, highly rewarding, sustainable, nurturing things happen. Meaning it's fantastic to be in that neck of the woods, and you can do it all day long. Over here is burnout, fatigue, PTSD. It's 21st century normal. It's high, constant beta wave activity in our brains, constant ruminating, high fight-flight stress response, norepinephrine and cortisol, often agitated heart rhythm, typically shallow chest breathing, low CO2 in our system, slumped, rolled, collapsed chest. I mean, we know it, right? We know that look and feel. So once we know it, we can shift it. And rather than talking at us about all of this stuff, we can actually just tune the knobs and levers over to the right-hand side. And then we can see who's home. And who's home is typically a more situationally aware, more resilient, more adaptive person. And this is what it looks like when you put it in gear. Right? This is arguably what happens when you say, hey, how do I get into those states? Because it's not just sort of like, that's a cool aspirational thing. I'd love to do more of that, please. Right? It's actually a predictable cycle. This work comes out of Herb Benson's work at Harvard University as well. He has a great book called The Breakout Principle, if you're interested in taking a look at it. And we combine this with research with some of our colleagues at Red Bull with the neuroelectricity and the endocrine system. So basically what this says is, it's not a light switch, and you can't just be in normal and then get into a flow state, and the heavens part, and the, the angels trumpet. The idea is this starts with most things hard. It starts with struggle. It starts with challenge. From the challenge, you can either go into a fight or flight stress response and collapse. I think the technical term is shitting the bed, right? Or you can find a way, and most of us just, you might slam your laptop, chuck it out the window. You might say, stuff it, I'm going to go down to the pub and get a pint. You might go for a walk with the dog or the proverbial shower or bath, right? You do something to not just continue your brute force straight-on assault, and you pivot. And when you pivot, that nitric oxide that we talked about earlier flushes through your system. It takes away the stress chemicals. It brings in some of the reward and focus chemicals. Right? So norepinephrine's been helping me pay attention if it's not jacking me up too much. Dopamine comes in. I start making patterns and connections. I start realizing, there's a way through this. My brainwave activity drops from high frequency beta into alpha and maybe even theta. Right? I start getting pain relief, endorphins, anandamide, more pattern recognition comes on. I start performing at a higher and higher level. And then that state lasts as long as it does and I can. Sometimes it's just seconds to minutes. Sometimes it's hours, particularly if you're in a high-stress situation like a firefight. You will find at the end, you'll literally feel yourself powering down. Right? You'll realize that you were in that heightened state, and then it switches off, and you just sort of want to curl up in a ball and sleep for 14 hours. And that's the final stage, recovery. And there's a lot about recovery, but typically, elite performers are crap at it. It's seen as a sign of weakness. When we were working with Dev Group, that was the #1 issue, right? Which is how do you actually take high performers? Because this is the thing. For the people you lead, right? Young kids, off the streets of London and Glasgow, they come through here for a year, they're sort of brought up to speed, given a code, given an ethics, given a way of doing things they might never have had in their life. They've had no role models, right? One of the things you actually want to be teaching them is to struggle harder. Struggle more gracefully. The way out is through. Stoicism 101. You actually need to give them a loving kick in the ass to actually keep going through that phase. That's the loading phase, which will allow them to get into the peak state. For you lot, it's the opposite. It's actually creating permission for active recovery, not as a sign of weakness, not as a sign of need, not as a sign of I'm getting taken out of the game, as a sign as an essential prerequisite for sustainable high performance. If you think about Tour de France riders, they have chefs, they have mechanics, they have masseuses, they have other riders on their team. They have an entire team just so they can get on the bike and do the impossible thing for 14 days straight. You guys are those riders. The only difference is that elite athletes spend 90% of their time in training and recovery, 10% of the time on the pitch. What's your ratio? How sustainable is that? So, I just want to share with you a little bit about what's going on now, a few studies that are interesting, because we talked about earlier, we said, hey, 10 years ago, everything was balkanized. There were all these silos. No one was talking about this stuff. But lately, there have been simultaneous advancements in these 4 fields, right? Psychology, technology, neurobiology, and pharmacology, and each one of them is giving us access to that chart that we had up there, that matrix. Right? Each one of them is giving us access to ways to tweak those knobs and levers for positive gain. So I just want to, the term loosely is called hedonic engineering. Right? How do we actually use a methodological, evidence-based approach to tweaking and tuning states of consciousness, both individually and collectively? So the first is just an example from technology. University of Sydney had people do the classic sort of creativity problem, which is a 3x3 box, and you have to connect all the dots without going off the page in as few lines as possible. Right? Normally, sort of 5% of a study group, maybe 10% max, can pull this off. The rest, stuff it. In particular control group, no one did it. But then they did something interesting. They hooked up all the study subjects to transcranial magnetic stimulation, where basically it's like a sort of jumper cable lobotomy. The idea is you just pulse the magnetic energy through the frontal lobe, you knock out all that conscious thinking of like, oh, I'm a dumbass, or someone else has done it first, or what is this bloody thing, it's stupid anyway. You just zoop, shut that out for about 35 to 45 minutes. After they did that, 40% of the group solved the puzzle, nearly immediately. Another study, some colleagues of ours working with DARPA created the new EEG headset. So if you guys have seen those kind of Medusa caps that people put on, and they kind of have wet gels and all this kind of stuff. So DARPA invested a couple $1 million in coming up with a new higher tech skull cap to do EEG stimulation. And they did something fascinating. They actually they studied experts doing a task and then novices. And they noticed what parts of the expert's brain lit up when they were doing the hard thing, think about snipers, think about marksman, target acquisition, any of that stuff, and said, okay, what's going on for them that's not going on for the beginner? Now, can we go and stimulate in the beginners the parts that were lighting up in the expert and see if that can help them faster? So they took US Air Force radar operators looking at images from Iraq and looking at enemy combatants and vehicles and potential IED locations. Their hit rate on scores and correct identification just from direct electrical stimulation went up 60%. Another one, a study several decades ago at Stanford University, solving wicked problems, which is arguably the theme of this entire gathering, right? Complex problems that when you try and solve them create additional unexpected consequences, right? They actually microdosed a team of engineers that had been struggling for 6 months or longer on hard technical problems and gave them sub-perceptual threshold doses of LSD and mescaline. Now, before that sort of seems scandalous, realize the really interesting thing here is they both interact with the serotonin system. So sub-perceptual threshold means they didn't actually feel anything. They weren't in a self-perceived altered state. It produced 6 patents, and 7 out of the 11 problems were solved in an afternoon session. DARPA is already investing additional money in actually detuning any of the psychoactive effects of psilocybin and MDMA so that they can just be used comparably to a sort of high-octane Prozac, still engaging the serotonin system, but with none of the wobblies of a classic psychedelic effect. This one, again, another Navy example, but this was the US Navy, they built a full-scale replica of a nuclear-class submarine, packed in a bunch of recruits, and tracked them with biometrics, heart rate variability, galvanic skin response, pupil dilation, and watched them for 3 months perform all the tasks and activities of a high-pressure, in a tin can, underwater nuclear sub team. They were able to detect, without knowing who was who were the beginner groups, who were the intermediate groups beginning to gel, who were the expert groups, and most critically for you guys, who were the squeaky wheels? Who were the members of each team that were actually preventing the team from dropping into coherent states? So this doesn't require feedback, this doesn't require other folks getting hacked off, this doesn't require late night bitch sessions. You could actually spot ahead of self-awareness exactly where the group dynamics were and exactly who was thwarting or supporting the goal, the tactical goals. And then finally, psychology. The ability to train, and this is something that general infantry probably doesn't always have the time to do. SAS, SBS, right, SEAL teams, Delta Force do. But the capacity to actually become so attuned, jazz musicians do this in the way they practice and listen to each other. But the ability to so acutely attune to each other that you essentially generate a collective intelligence, a sort of hive mind. And a classic example of this was the Red Bull Air Force and their ability to wingsuit. This was for the, what is it called, Transformers 3. Not exactly an Oscar winner, but if any of you have seen it, it was actually, they did a live sequence for that wingsuit event, and it was jumping off the Sears Tower in Chicago. Now, you obviously can't practice that, but they had to make microsecond turns. The ability to throw their chutes was so precise. They had 1.5 seconds that they all had to throw their chutes, or someone was going to slam into a skyscraper or end up on the concrete. So they went to Switzerland and they practiced on a clean base jump site. And they said by the end of that month, he could literally tell, J.T. Holmes was the lead flyer, what he was going to do just by watching the big toe on his left foot. So that's the ability to actually hone in. And obviously, any time you guys are engaged in that sort of intensive practice, you're getting a sense of that. So that's the landscape. That's what's happening today. That's what's possible. And that's what arguably is required. As E.O. Wilson, the famous Harvard biologist, said this, as far as speaking to our current predicament. We've got Paleolithic brains, man. Evolution takes 50,000 years. We're all just monkeys with clothes. And somehow we've ended up with all this complexity. And we've got medieval institutions, many of which are tearing at the seams right now. But we've got godlike technology. So the question becomes is, what do we do to close that gap? How do we train our brains to find our minds and do what must be done? Thank you all very much.